Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Mohawk Motors. My name is Jason. It's time to get my 4L60 bolted up to my LQ4 so we can get this thing sitting into the silver single cab. If you're not familiar with these engines, there's a couple things you need to know, and I'm going to show you how to do it. All right, team, so got the engine up on the hoist. Before I get any further, I had a little housekeeping to do. So I went through, I chased all my bell housing bolt holes with the thread tap and sanded off the paint from the bell housing flange. That way we'll have good contact, good continuity. Some of the electronics in the transmission use case ground. So I want to make sure I have good ground from the transmission to the engine to the battery. Now, a little more housekeeping to do. I need to replace my rear cover. Actually, I'm just replacing the rear cover seal and the rear main gasket, the rear main seal as well. It's already got a new oil pan gasket, as you've seen from the previous videos. This is not a rear cover, rear main seal tutorial, so I'm just gonna do it, and then I'll bring you back and we'll get into the technical stuff and what I really want to show you on this. All right, guys, so I'm done with my housekeeping. New rear cover seal, new rear main seal, a little bit of dab of RTV, bolts torqued, good to go. Now, let's get into the technical stuff here. So, if you've messed around or read in forums on these engines, you may have heard about a long crank and a short crank. I think a more accurate way to put this would be long crank or standard crank. Now, the long crank is the one that you're probably not going to come across. They only used the long crank in 99 and 2000. I'm pretty sure by 2001, they just went to the standard crank in all the engines and used a spacer to make up the difference for the 4L80 transmission. So what I'm talking about here is the crankshaft. Now this is a 2004 6-liter, so it has what I would call a standard crank, meaning that the crankshaft sticks out from the back of the engine the same distance as the 4.8 and the 5.3 liter engines. Standard distance, okay? Now the long crank that people talk about will actually stick out a bit farther. It'll poke out about this far. And like I said, those are only in the 99 and 2000 truck engines, like the 6 liters that came attached to a 4L80. And I have an example here I can show you of what they did to make up for it. So in 2001, when GM standardized the crankshaft, they started adding a spacer to the back of it to make up for the difference between the 4L60 and the 4L80. And that spacer is on the back of this flex plate here. Now this is a flex plate. If I remember correctly, this is off like a 2003 6-liter and a 2500 that came attached to a 4L80. And you can see right here, this spacer. And that makes the spacing correct so that you can bolt the 6-liter engine up to the 4L80 transmission. We're bolting a 4L60 to our 6-liter engine. Now, the 4L60, 4L65, and 4L70, they all fit inside the same case. GM just changes the internals. In the, let's see, 2002 to 2006, Denali's, Escalades, the Silverado SS, those came from the factory with a 6-liter engine and a 4L65 transmission. And GM, to make those bolt together, like I said, they used the standard crank and this flex plate. And you can see here, I don't know if it shows up well on camera, but It's kind of dished on the back, appears flat on the front. When you install this one, this makes the spacing correct so that you can bolt your 4L60 transmission, 4L65, 4L70 to a standard crank 6-liter. I don't have one to show you, but there's a special flex plate you need to get that is dished in the opposite direction if you want to put a long crank engine with a 4L60 transmission. Okay. This flywheel, this is just a standard flywheel, factory replacement from a 2003 Yukon Denali. That truck would have come from the factory with a 6-liter LQ4 and a 4L60 transmission. Technically a 4L65, but again, it's the same case. So outside, the dimensions are the same, and that's what we're going to do to bolt these things together. All right, so I've got my flex plate. Get it lined up here with the indexing hole. Get all my bolts started. Guys, it's a good thing I left the oil pan to rear cover bolts out, because I definitely would have forgotten to do that rear cover seal and rear main seal if I hadn't done that. That saved me from forgetting. And then getting it all together and then being like, oh crap, I didn't actually put new seals in everywhere like I meant to. All right, I'm going to torque them down to 74 foot-pounds. Oh, it wants to turn. Let me get my anti-turning tool. You guys, in case you can't tell, I'm just sticking my screwdriver into the teeth of the flex plate and holding against one of the dowel pins in the back of the block. One more. There we go. All good. All right, so engine is ready to accept the transmission now. I've got a little bit more housekeeping to do. I'm gonna clean off my front mating surface of my bell housing, get this little bit of crud down here tidied up, cleaned up, and then slip the converter on. And the converter can be tricky, so I'll show you that also. All right, so we gotta get this converter into the transmission. And there's really, it's not super complicated, guys. You need to get the input shaft splines engaged, the stator support splines engaged, and the drive dogs for the pump engaged. So you're kind of looking, feeling for 3 distinct clunks. So I did put a quart of fluid into the transmission, the torque converter first. It's an off-the-shelf 3000 stall converter, nothing special, nothing fancy, but it should be just fine for this engine, drivetrain, rear gear. It should be just fine for our application here. So I find something that helps is take a peek in and see if you can see where your dogs, your drive dogs are, and try to line your little notches in the torque converter up with those right as you put it up. gotten two clunks, which is the input shaft and the stator support. Now we're trying to get onto our dogs for our pump. And the trick here is if you push the torque converter in to where it's touching the pump but not lined up, it'll spin the pump. Yeah, all right, I'm gonna pull it back out. Whoa, take another look. See where my pump dogs are. Okay, they're almost horizontal. That should make this a little bit easier. I think that's it. I think we got it. Yeah, that feels like it's in far enough. I think we're there. Yeah. All right, she's in. I'll wipe the little bit of ATF that spilled out as I set it up there, and then we'll get this mated up to the engine. All right, now the tricky part, get this stuff slid together. It actually shouldn't be too bad on this one. I've got a little bit of one, there's the other. Get a bolt in there. All right, let's run these in. Gentle. There we go. Disclaimer, if you are not 100% positive that your setup is going to work and everything is right and good and you're not going to have clearance issues, do not use an impact to draw your bell housing bolts in, because it is super duper easy to shatter the pump if you don't have the pump lined up. It is super easy to snap an ear off the bell housing if you don't have the bell housing lined up. So if you are not 100% confident that you've got everything right and that it's going to go together the way it should, do not do what I just did. All right, that looks good. We gotta get the two bottom bell housing bolts in. There you go, that side lined right up. Start it in, easy peasy. How's this side gonna go? Also lined up, started in, easy peasy. Now, full disclosure, I don't know of any torque spec on these, but .45 foot-pounds seems like a good number. I know there's people that just run them down as tight as they'll go. I think 45 will be just fine for what we're doing. Can I get this one? Yep. Get this one. There we go. I think that's all of them. Give them a quick check. Good to go. All right, now we can do our little transmission breather. That gets a little 13mm nut. And our transmission dipstick tube gets a little 13mm nut. And in case you don't know, the correct bolt nuts for this, the fixed washer should go on the breather. The rotating washer should go on the dipstick. And I guess that only really matters if you're as much of a stickler for detail as I am, which most people probably are not. But there we go, that's it. We gotta pick it up, we'll do our torque converter bolts. All right, everybody, so we're on the final step here, which is get the torque converter bolts in. The 4L60, 4L65, 4L70 uses 3 torque converter bolts that go through the flex plate into the torque converter. Now, a good check to do and just verify you don't have anything bound up, that your torque converter isn't too far into the crank, too far out of the crank, or just tight for some other reason, is you should be able to freely move it before you put the bolts in. So you can see here, I've got it right now lined up with one of the bolt holes and one of the threaded holes in the converter. You see, I can put my fingers behind the flex plate and I can easily spin the torque converter. So that tells me I don't have anything bound up. There's nothing tight or wrong or anything like that. Now, the next thing I need to do here is make sure I have the correct amount of pull out from the transmission when I tighten the bolts on the torque converter. And what I mean there is, right now the torque converter is pushed as far into the transmission as it'll go, and I have about 1/8 of an inch of space between the back side of the flex plate and the flanges where the torque converter bolts, where the torque converter interfaces with the flex plate. That's about how much gap you want. You want to, so when I tighten my bolts, that's going to pull the torque converter slightly out of the transmission, about 1/8 of an inch, and then that's where it'll sit. And that's enough that my dogs will have as much engagement into the pump as possible without being bound up or too tight or anything like that. So between 1/8 and 1/16 of an inch of pull out is what you're looking for. If you're going to have more than that, you can use some washers or shims to take up that space, because you don't want to pull it out more than 1/8 of an inch, because then you're going to start losing engagement with the pump dogs, with the drive dogs, and then you get all kinds of problems from that. It can break the pump, it won't pump consistently, all kinds of issues. So we want about 1/8 of an inch of pull out, which everything seems to be spaced just about right, that's what we're going to have. So I'll get all 3 torque converter bolts started, and then I'll tighten all 3 of them down. All right, got all my torque converter bolts torqued down, and one last little piece here is our little dust cover. Goes right there, fits in, helps to keep stuff out from there where it doesn't belong. There we go. It's hard to do with my not smart hand. Ta-da! Dust cover in place. I'm not going to put the starter on yet. I'm going to wait until I get it in the truck to do that. Which means that's the end of this video, guys. I've got the engine and the transmission bolted together. Really not a super complex or convoluted process, but helps to have a little bit of extra knowledge, especially if you're changing things. And yeah, it's ready. It's ready to be plopped down in the truck. And that's going to be the next video you see. That's it for this one, guys. We're moving the needle closer and closer to drive, and I am pumped. So thanks a lot for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and until the next video, take care.